Hello and welcome to the Lukex podcast. I'm your host, Dan Morrice, and with me in the studio today is my good friend, Pete Kessell.
Hello.
In today's episode, we journey back to our expedition from Egypt to Nazareth across the Negev desert. A journey with trials and triumphs, with literal mountaintop and dark valley moments, and a journey which, in many ways, ties together much of what we've learned in the other episodes in this series. What was this perilous journey? How did we survive? And what can a desert encounter teach this generation in this moment? Let's find out. So, my fellow desert expedition partner, first of all, thank you for joining me on that first frontier from the border with Egypt and the Negev. I don't think I could have done it without you.
My pleasure.
I mean, we're not really built for deserts, us West Country folk. You're Cornish.
I am indeed, yeah, a bit of a contrast. It's more rugged moors in Cornwall. I always thought a desert was going to be sandy. You know, you imagine the Sahara, but the Negev is not like that. It's a bit like the moon.
It is basically a giant rocky mountainous moonscape.
Yeah.
Which is not Bodmin.
It's far from Bodmin.
So yeah, you had my back from the start. Actually, even before the start, I think the night before we left the UK, I had my stuff all laid out in my room. You came around just beforehand and just unpacked it. So you can't take all this stuff.
Why are you bringing these lead weights down?
Yeah. So I think I had slightly overpacked. It turns out, obviously, having to carry your kit 500 miles, you want to try and travel light if you can.
Laptop not required.
Well, quite. So I did take too much stuff. Fortunately, some of it, we dropped some stuff off in Jerusalem, and an Austrian hospice in the old city kindly looked after it. But I still took too much stuff even when we got to the desert. So I think one of the first things I did was give you some of my kit to carry.
That's right, mate. Share and share alike.
Quite, sharing is caring. So yeah, thank you for that. Maybe before we start, I should explain why I invited you to join me on this random expedition.
Probably a good idea.
So all the stories we've heard in the podcast so far, from Chilean miners to Middle Eastern refugees to former British football hooligans, they're all very different people, but they've had two sort of golden threads running through their stories. And one is the sort of surprising, almost defiant peace that these people have had. In desperate and dangerous situations, they've had an extraordinary peace which has overcome all the anxiety around them, flooded it with faith and love. But also that peace was a product of their faith in Jesus. It wasn't sort of something they mustered up, you know, in their own strength. I mean, a lot of people in Western culture, I think, or, you know, a lot of my mates are a little bit wary of any talk about Jesus or God. And I actually really get that. I think in Europe, we've got, you know, centuries of slightly odd and not very good history with religion, which I think makes people understandably nervous. But having said that, it's faith in this Jesus that has empowered all the peacemakers we've met on this podcast to do what they do, to have that overcoming faith, that extraordinary love for their neighbours and their enemies. So really I wanted to kind of ask, how do I understand faith in that original revolutionary figure without the sort of baggage of religion that European empires have introduced? So I thought, well, why not go back to his first memories? What was life like for that little boy Jesus at the very start of his life? The Professor N.T. Wright likes to say, if you want to get to know Jesus, you've got to make a pilgrimage to the first century, which I quite like. And obviously that's a historical research sort of operation, but I thought, well, it'd be nice to actually walk in his footsteps. And so his first memories probably would have been crossing a desert wilderness.
Yeah, when you mentioned that to me, I realised I'd never really thought about that.
Yeah.
I'd never thought about Jesus as... I thought about Jesus as a young boy. You know, you hear the stories of him going to the temple and his mum was like, where is Jesus gone?
Yeah.
But I'd never ever imagined Jesus walking from Egypt back to, you know, his home. I'd never imagined that.
And I guess it's just a small line. In Gospel of Matthew, they said he went home from Egypt to Nazareth. It was hundreds of miles. And the story that they paint of the Herods and the reason why they fled is sadly in keeping with what we know from Roman history, that Herod the Great was pretty savage. And so it would be entirely in keeping with what we'd expect of him if he heard there was a supposed rival king being born, to try and dispatch of that baby with a bloodbath. So yeah, Mary and Joseph took their toddler, fled into the night, and there was actually a sizable Jewish community in Egypt at the time. So just kind of hanging out on the periphery of the empire was, or Herod's mini empire would have been a wise move. Now, when he died, you're right, they went back to Jerusalem, but because Herod Archelaus, his son, was in power, who was also bloodthirsty and slightly psychotic. They kind of skirted round and went up to Nazareth. So obviously the journey that we made would never quite compare to the sort of endurance that he would have had to face. But, we still had wild dogs and hot deserts. And
yeah, that's right. I mean, he didn't have any absorbent EVA foamed shoes.
No, exactly. So in many ways, we kind of had it easy. But, I wanted to experience the sort of hardship of a desert, I suppose, and try and get into that original journey he would have made. So I called you for some moral support.
Yeah, thanks very much, mate. I was going to go to the Seychelles.
And I said, nah, drop that, mate. Come on, walk across the moon with me. In fact, actually, I should point out the artwork. So if you look at whatever the icon is, whatever podcast platform you're listening on, that little picture of a Luke X podcast of a blue sky and the little figure in the bottom left-hand corner of a desert, that is you.
That is me. And if you're listening and you're interested in modelling...
that tiny figure in the distance.
If you want me to be small, unrecognisable in a backpack, I'm your man.
Exactly. Can recommend. I actually took that photo, as you know, because you carried the camera. So.
I do. Oh, if it wasn't you, I'm a bit worried.
Yeah, exactly. Who took that? So preparing for this trip, obviously setting out to the desert, not really knowing what we signed up for. What were your sort of expectations? Anything you were nervous about, excited about?
I was really excited about the prospect of an adventure. I've done long distance walking before and across relatively remote places, but nothing like a desert. Was a very foreign thing for me. I've never been to Northern Africa or the Middle East or anything like that. So yeah, just the prospect of a desert was really exciting, also quite daunting. The main thing about deserts I hear is there's not a lot of water.
That's true.
So I think that was one of my main concerns. I think I messaged you in the month or so, it was like over Christmas and leading up to January saying, is the water situation sorted? Just checking that.
I've totally got this covered, mate. Don't worry.
Yeah. So you put my mind at rest.
Likewise, I was excited about an adventure. I was using this as a fundraiser as well, which I basically had read a lot about human trafficking, and I met some people who are really fighting against human trafficking, rescuing people, and I was really inspired. And so I wanted to do something. So I thought, if we're walking in the footsteps of the world's most famous refugee, why not raise money for refugees in this generation? So I did a fundraiser for A21. So I think I was nervous about what if I don't make it?
Yeah.
Will anyone sponsor a journey where you give up on day one? Probably not. Ironically, I wasn't really worried about water going to a desert because I thought I'd had it covered. That didn't work out, did it? So talk us through day one. How did it go?
A lot of ascent on the first day.
Yeah.
And turns out a good way to get through the desert is wadis.
Yeah. Ravines.
Ravines, yeah, just dry riverbeds. So there was just really interesting walking, tracking these wadis up through the desert. And there were lots of, obviously where there would have been a waterfall, there was quite big rock faces.
There was only one night when we needed a supply of water. So I planned, because the first night camp was near a road, I thought we could get a guy to drive up in a 4x4 and drop us off some water. And after that, we weren't going to get anywhere until the Timna Oasis, and that'd be a couple of days walk at least. But that didn't work out, did it? We got into camp.
And he hadn't messaged you, so you phoned him. And I think I was unpacking something. I could just hear you saying, what?
Yes. So yeah, he had apparently left the country. His wife answered the phone and said, yeah, he's gone. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure he said he'd drop us off some water.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of a disaster on day one, which was tough. So we did and it was starting to get cold. Like, the desert's crazy. It's so hot. And then as soon as the sun sets, it's brutally cold. Mm-hmm. So we're setting up night camp thinking, how are we going to get water for the next couple of days? It was a bit of a setback. We're obviously tired, having climbed from the sea level up to the top of the ridge. So we did what you normally do as a last resort, but it's become my first resort, which is pray and said, dear God, help. Yeah. And then actually 5 minutes after that prayer, what happened?
Well, just, complete silent middle of the desert. And then 2 Israeli women walk out of the darkness and into our camp.
I feel like there should be a soundtrack to that.
There should, yeah.
Maybe something for Wonder Woman.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, it was great. I think they were just having a weekend away, weren't they?
Yeah.
And they were very, very resourced and very prepared.
Yeah, more than us.
Which it's not hard.
No.
So I very, very clearly remember one of them cutting up fresh beetroot and just handing us slices of beetroot. And there was just something really nice about that.
That's fresh.
Just having a great discussion about why we were there, asking them questions about their experience with the conflict and everything like that. And they were really intrigued as to our reason for walking, as you were saying before, in the footsteps of Jesus. And it was just a great evening, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was amazing. And they were very gracious, I remember. So I think before I'd left in the UK, I'd had lots of people who give me a very strong narrative before. I'd been to Israel before and to Palestine. I'd done the olive harvest in the West Bank and interviewed Jews in Jerusalem. And so I was starting to engage in the area a bit and speak to people from different communities. But I find people often in the West are not even interested in listening. They just, as soon as you mention you're going to Israel, you can get bombarded with this sort of narrative, either of just real negativity or on the opposite. I've met people who think Israel can do no wrong. And it was a bit weird, actually, being sort of bombarded with very polarized views. Like any situation, it's nice to meet people first before you start. It's important to listen before you start forming sort of political views. And so just to meet some ordinary Jewish girls, like you say, who were kind, who looked after us.
Yeah, that's right.
And who were quite happy to ask our opinion. They weren't even defending Israel. They say, what do you think? And I remember saying that we're really happy that Jewish people have a homeland. But we're also concerned about the treatment of Palestinians, the building houses in the West Bank, the treatment of people in Gaza. And they said, yeah, I know. They were quite actively critical of their own government in some ways and not ashamed to, not like, how dare you criticize us, but also saying to us, like, do you know what it's like to be in a conflict zone? And we're like, no, not really. So it's just really frank, quite honest, quite open, quite humble. And it kind of set the scene, really, and they were just really nice to us.
Yeah.
So they rescued us, really.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, like you say, I think it's very easy to take quite a low resolution perspective on something when you're so distant. Especially when it involves people, when you haven't met the people involved. Yeah. And when you actually, just talking to not just those two women, but other people we met on the way, just makes you realize it's so much more complex and nuanced than just, not telling the story of the media is always presenting, which it sometimes is quite polarized views, but it's always more complicated and more interesting.
Yeah. And they're just people. They were human beings.
Right.
What was interesting was they weren't supposedly meant. They said to us, no one comes into the desert in January because they think it's too cold. I thought it was pretty hot, to be honest. And it is supposedly the rainy season. That didn't happen. I think the rainy season...
We didn't see a day of rain, did we? No, I didn't.
No, a little bit further north. But I think my definition of rainy season from England is different to theirs. So, but I guess if there's a they suddenly get a downpour, there's a flash flood in a wadi, it can be dangerous. But we kind of took that risk. And so did they, apparently.
Yeah. And they helped us out with water.
Yeah, they did. So they texted one of their mates who had buried some water. And actually, we woke up in the morning, they're gone into the dawn, almost as if, did we imagine that? And there was 6 litres of water just waiting outside our tent.
Yeah.
Oh, so kind.
Yeah, it was just the fact that they'd left the water there for us. It was wonderful and just completely changed my mindset of the rest of the journey, really. Like, it looks like someone is looking out for us.
Yeah, and I think that sort of hospitality continued. So in every people group, I found all the way up for 500 miles, I was rescued regularly by Jews, Christians, Muslims, Arab, Israeli. Every town, every village I went through, someone just scooped me up, took me in, treated me like a brother. And that sort of, when you've experienced that hospitality day after day, it's just impossible to have a sort of polarized narrative because you see there's good people off the beaten track all over the place. And it doesn't take away the conflict. It doesn't mean that all the difficult questions aren't answered, but it just gives you a fresher perspective that whatever's going on at the top level or at the most extreme level, it's not necessarily the narrative of every person. But I think actually in terms of experiencing community, I wanted to ask you, because obviously being the recipient of people taking you into their community and looking after you is amazing. But also in previous episodes, we've talked about the sort of community house network in Bristol, and you're part of that. So you're a part of a community house. Tell us a bit about that, some of the highs and lows and what you love about living in community.
So I moved into a house, there's 8 people in our house, and just experienced a very different way of living where your home is very open, I guess. So we've had so many different people live with us since I've been there. There was this girl that turned up, was sleeping on a bench in a nearby park. And it turned out she was a refugee from Morocco and was 7 months pregnant.
Wow.
At the time, we were part of this group called the Bristol Hospitality Network, and they put her in touch with us. And we had a spare room. Okay. So she moved in, and it was kind of a little bit like a nativity story in the sense that her and my housemate gave birth within about a week from each other. Wow. Over Christmas. And there was just something really precious about thinking, where would this woman be? You know, and it's just such a privilege to be able to have a spare room and to have her with us and to help her, just to know that she wasn't alone.
No.
And that was just wonderful, seeing the power and utility of community, really. And yeah, we've had a few stories like that in the time that I've been there.
Oh, that's amazing. And like I say, I mean, it was nice to hear stories of people who have offered that hospitality and then received it. And that's the culture. I mean, this is you read through the Gospels, this is kind of normal. And I'd still say it's normal in the Middle East now. It's just assumed if you're in need, someone will take you in. And the flip side is you will take someone else in. And I feel like it's nice when you rediscover that a little bit. And in a very individualized, quite like I've got my own little space sort of culture that we're in. It's nice to kind of buck that trend. And, you know, I think if you receive it, you're also more willing to give it. And often it's just being a bit more uncomfortable and just being willing to say, okay, I'm going to let go of my own little personal space and agenda to let someone into my home. Yeah. But as you say, the rewards are amazing. Like, you'll never forget what it's like to look after that lady and see her flourish and see her child raised in community rather than, I don't know, in a hostel or in a park. Goodness me.
Yeah, there's a phrase in community that you get your edges knocked off. Yeah. And I have a lot of sharp edges. I think that's the thing I've realized. I mean, it definitely isn't easy, as you said. You know, a lot of people in your personal space, people that don't do things the same way as you, or, you know, they're messy in a way that you notice and you're messy in a way that they notice. Yeah. But we do all have edges, and it's good to have that interaction with people and just be able to, I'm still really learning how to do it, but how to compromise and how to live together. Yeah.
And at the end of the day, when you look back, it's always worth it, isn't it?
Right.
You remember the relationships. You don't remember the dishwasher not being loaded.
No. On my better days, yeah.
But exactly the same in the desert. We wandered into town, and it could be quite easy for a guy to think when he's getting up early to go on a farm at 5 o'clock in the morning, and we stumble in late at night thinking, do I really want to take in a couple of smelly Brits, and cook for them? But people did. So that's amazing. Yeah. So it was wonderful to experience hospitality from people. But one of the questions I was wondering as I kind of walked this desert path is we experienced a lot of what seemed like extraordinary providence. I was, as we've established, making a lot of rookie errors out of my depth from the word go. And you had my back, which was wonderful in the first sort of week. Particularly as I carried on alone, I just experienced sometimes in the most dangerous places what seemed like an amazing coincidence. Someone would just be there at the right time, at the right moment. Even from the day one when we met those Israeli women and they gave us water. And I think people back home, I've got friends who are quite religious and who would always jump to saying that was God's provision. And I've got friends who are very, who are atheists who would say, no, you were lucky, And I actually feel like I always try and sit in the middle and hear every sort of possible explanation. And so, I wrestled with that. I think there's times when I thought, was I just lucky? Was it a coincidence? If I'm reading into that, is it just confirmation bias? Or am I being too cynical? And actually, I prayed for help and help came. God's in that. How would you read that sort of balance?
Oh, it's a difficult question. I think, like a lot of things, and this is don't want to have a too mystical an answer, but like a lot of things in the Christian faith, it's a massive paradox and tension. Like, we live in a hugely chaotic universe. That's self-evident all around us. People get sick and die, and just entropy, everything's spreading out and getting colder. But there's also life and hope, and where does that come from? And I think growing up as a Christian, personally, for me, it can be quite easy to get into the narrative of kind of a Disneyfied faith of when good things happen, that's because God did it. And when bad things happen, that's because, I don't know, I've gone outside of what God's will for me or something like that. And I'm kind of coming to the point where I don't think it's quite like that.
Yeah.
I think, again, it's more complicated. And I think the more important thing is the lens that you look at the order and the chaos through. And for me, that's, there's a really great quote, I can't remember who it's by, but under friendly skies, and just like looking at life and saying, right, I trust that God is good and that his intentions for me are good. And therefore, when Israeli women rock up out of the desert and give me some water, I'm going to thank him for that. And when I fall over and like twist my ankle on a rock, I'm not going to blame him or perhaps blame myself. I mean, I'm at fault for lots of other things, but
and I guess also our faith is stronger than trying to interpret every situation, for good or bad. And you're right, it is nice when you're stuck and something completely out of your control comes to the rescue, whatever that is. If anything, it's humbling because you think, well, I didn't have this and I wouldn't have made it without that. So whatever happens, I can't slap myself on the back because something's looking after me.
That's right. I think that's that is a key point. I have no control over my breathing and my heart pumping, and therefore everything that we have is a gift.
Yeah, exactly.
And therefore the things that we ask for that we get given are even more of a miracle.
Exactly. Yeah. I guess you come away grateful. That's how in finishing the expedition, I remember people saying, are you going to be really proud of yourself when you make it? And actually I felt so weak when I finally arrived up in Galilee. I was just so grateful that I'd made it with a million little, helps along the way. It was impossible to feel overconfident because I knew at every stage it could have gone wrong and it didn't. And I was lucky to have made it, really. Yeah.
So speaking of being overconfident, I've been in the desert with you for a week. We'd made a good bit of headway. I think we were around Beersheba, somewhere like that.
Yeah.
And so, off I wandered with my little bag of rubbish. Leave only memories. And I got the bus to Beersheba and back to Tel Aviv and flew home.
Yeah. And in that moment, I branched the other way. So you went east to the road and got a bus up, and I went west just into wilderness. And you took a little clip of me just walking away, looking quite jolly. But there's this sort of sense you look at and think, that guy doesn't know what he's getting himself into, which was true.
Yeah. Yeah. So off I went. I was tired.
Yeah.
My feet hurt. My back hurt. Yeah. So I was a bit sad to leave the desert. I could have happily done another week, but at the same time, I was looking forward to a hot shower and a bed. And not sleeping on the rocky ground. So I did feel for you a bit leaving you behind in the desert. So what was that like?
I think I was actually more nervous about it in the days leading up to it. Because when we started, I was struggling with the kit, with the weight, with my boots, and the feeling. And just 500 miles is a long way. So when you're struggling on day one, you think, oh my goodness, what's it going to be like when Pete goes? But actually in that moment, I think when you have to do something, you just step up. I've got no choice. And then there's almost a freedom that you're like, well, this is it. Off we go then. I was definitely nervous, but I was encouraged by the fact that I was doing this as a sort of pilgrimage of sorts to try and experience what life was like crossing a desert 2,000 years ago for that young boy Jesus. And actually it would have been the same for him. The valleys and the wolves and the dogs and the heat and the cold of night, all the kind of physical things are the same. The desert hasn't changed. If it's hard for me as an adult, what would it be like for a child of 5? So I kind of wanted to experience everything, the highs and the lows, as a kind of window into his early life, really.
There was one thing that helped me, and this actually came up in the Chile episode where Jose Enriquez talked about in his sort of moment in the mine, when the mine collapsed, he had a prophecy from his grandmother before he went down that almost prepared him for that moment. And I actually had something similar. It's quite strange, but I hadn't told many people about this trip before I left, partly because I was a bit worried I might not make it, and I didn't want to be that guy that's, all talk, and then I come home after a week, sorry, my feet hurt. So I thought I'll keep it on the down low, and then I can be a bit more open about it if I make it. But there was a lady in my church who knew nothing of the expedition, and she just came to see me a few weeks before I left and said, I was praying and I had a picture of you sort of flash into my mind dressed as an explorer hiking across a desert. And she said, and I feel like God's saying you need to be brave. So she kind of tentatively shared this with me, thinking it's a bit weird, and asked, you going for a sort of desert stage in life? And I'm like, no, that's not a metaphor. I am about to cross a desert, and I probably will need to be brave. And she was kind of quite excited that obviously she'd tapped into something more specific than she'd realised. And then when we later shared photographs on Instagram, she was like, yeah, it's literally what I saw before it happened, which was quite... In some ways, it was a bit scary when she said, and you're going to have to be brave. I'm like, oh, great.
Why?
What's happening? Yeah. But I also thought if you're prepared for something in advance, I don't know, I just thought like if God in his wisdom prepared me for this moment, then he's got a plan. So if that's be brave, and that's what I'm going to do. So I didn't feel like it, but sometimes bravery isn't not feeling fear. It's cracking on anyway.
Yeah. Courage was required. There were wolves when I left.
Yeah, yeah. We didn't see the wolves when I was with you, and then I hadn't checked the wildlife guide on the way because I thought it was a desert. Nothing lives in a desert.
What types of wolves are in the Negev?
Yeah. So I was all alone by myself, and then I suddenly realised I wasn't alone after all. I saw a wolf sort of scamper past one morning, and I thought that's funny. So I Googled it, which I shouldn't have done. It seems Israel's a crazy country because even if you're in the middle of nowhere and there's no water, you can always get a signal. Yeah. So I looked it up, and yes, indeed, there were wolves in the Negev. And so that kind of threw me a bit, if I'm honest. I don't think the Israelis are so concerned about wolves. In fact, I met a desert rescue guy in Arad on the way out, and he said something along the lines of, wolves? Don't be a pansy, they won't hurt you. So I think they see wolves as like an urban fox.
Yeah, or a badger.
Yeah, exactly. Give you a nasty nip if you're trapped on a lift with one, but probably won't happen.
Yeah. So apart from the wolves, or even including the wolves, what was the kind of hardest moment in those first few weeks?
I think I left the map at one point. So I'd gone too slowly. And I had to get to Jerusalem for a certain date. So Louise Glenn, who had joined me in Chile, she was coming out with another friend, Danko. They were teachers. So I'd had their half term. They had a week to come and join me in Jerusalem. And I had to get to Jerusalem to meet them. So I couldn't faff around in the desert for an extra month. And also I had to get water, I had to get food. I was getting weaker. It wasn't a race, but it wasn't in my interest to hang around. So I was trying to get there quickly. And I realized there was a big loop that kind of went west up to Mitzpah Ramon. I might have said that wrong, but it was a long sort of detour. No. And I clocked, basically, if I cut the sort of neck off this horseshoe, I could get there quicker. But I left the trail. I left any sense of civilization. I left the map that I had. I had a trajectory. I knew where I was heading. I could see the horizon. I just took a shortcut, basically. It was a shortcut that lasted 2 days. So it was a bit of a risk. And there was another sort of trail that led that way. So I'm like, I'll be all right. And I could see where the trail headed off the map. And then a couple of pages later in my guide, I could see where the map would pick it up. So off I went, and I was tired by then. I'd been going probably, over 100 miles by that point, and I was feeling it. And I just had a moment where, I knew there was wolves. I was all by myself. I was very tired. I had to climb a mountain. I was off the map. I was running out of water, and I started to feel scared. And again, I prayed that great prayer, "Dear Lord, help," that's sustained me thus far. And actually, there was a remarkable moment when I felt most fearful when I prayed, and I had a bizarre sense of peace, which I had seen in others on this journey. I mean, that's why I wanted to write this book, Finding the Peacemakers. I wanted to track down people who had this sort of defiant peace. But in that moment, I'd say I experienced just a small glimmer of what I'd seen in other people. And it was like the whole sort of ravine was just saturated with this real peace. I couldn't explain it. Up until that moment, I'd been so scared, and the fear lifted, and I almost skipped down this trail. And just when I thought, well, I kind of wondered about it in hindsight. I'm like, was I just crazy? Was I starved? Was I hallucinating? But actually, it started to get more specific in terms of how I I navigated that ravine. So I was kind of climbing up a massive ridge. And as I got to the end of this narrow ravine that led to the sort of beginning of the ascent, I hit a sort of polished slab of rock that was just unclimbable. My pack by that point was probably a third of my body weight. And I'm not, I've done a bit of climbing, but I'm not Bear Grylls. And I don't think I've got it. It's a polished slab. There's nothing to hold on to. But I tried to sort of pick a route around the outside, and I had a really strong conviction. It felt like a divine interruption saying, go back. And it was a weird thing. But in that moment, I had no choice. I'm like, okay, God.
Yeah, I'm lost in the desert. Do I go left or right? It's a bit more specific. Yeah,
exactly. And I followed that urge. I felt him say, go back. And then I felt go left. And I sort of followed what felt like divine instructions laid on my heart. And that is what happened. He guided me perfectly across this valley to a tiny path on the left-hand side, which I'd never have seen originally. And that was the path up and over this slab that I'd foolishly been planning to climb. And to safety, and I got up. It was a technical climb, but obviously the path was a path rather than a slab of rock. So that got me up there, and it was wonderful. I got up there, I set up camp, and on the top there was a little weather station, and there was actually a road from the other side of a ravine. So I felt like I got back into civilization. I kind of at the time didn't think much of it. Then looking back, and I went through the what ifs. I'm like, if I hadn't obeyed that strange conviction, would I be here now? And actually, Elisa, who illustrated this book, in fact, you introduced us.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
a mutual friend.
Another local.
Another West Country lass. So a wonderful illustrator. And so she, as we were working on the book together on the script, she read that little bit of a story I've just shared. And she said that her parents, when they were younger, had taken an expedition out into the Negev, and they stumbled across a dead body in a ravine. A guy had fallen and died, and it was a skeleton basically. And they later identified him from his belt buckle. Yeah. Which is quite bleak. And so when you hear that sort of story, you think, goodness me, that could have been me. I think that was for me one of those ones where I felt that was more than just a coincidence. So I never want to overclaim the ones where it's just like, we could have bumped into those Israeli girls anyway, and they could have given us water. But that moment when you feel like you're being led to a specific path in what was literally the valley of a shadow of death, like David says in Psalm 23, that felt special. And so it felt like, I don't know, sometimes you feel like someone's looking after you, but other times, even if life is not going well, or it's not easy, it's not like I was parachuted out of that valley and just dumped in Jerusalem. I think if you feel like you're prepared for it or someone's with you, having that sense that God's with you is almost better than just being rescued.
Absolutely.
And I think that's true of even human relationships. Like real good friendships are forged in adversity. So like our friendship was stronger as a result of you bailing me out on a million occasions and just forgiving little moments. I remember that first night when I had not got water sorted. And that was also the same night that I think I dropped half our dinner in the fire. You passed me the saucepan, and there's the little clicky thing that you hold on to, and I hadn't got that.
I've forgotten about that, mate. Thanks.
I tipped it on the floor, and our pasta got covered in sand, and I could see you were like, "Oh, this is a low moment." You just kind of took it on the chin and went, "That's okay, accidents happen." There's just moments like that where you were forgiving or just kind or helpful. And actually, that's a deeper level of friendship than we've got if we're just sitting in the pub having a chat, having a pint. And I think it's the same. And if it's the same in a friendship, then why not in the same with your faith in God? If you struggle through something together and you feel like he's looking after you, then that's a deeper level of faith and love than if everything's always easy.
Absolutely, yeah.
So as we reflect on this sort of whole adventure, what are your sort of take-home thoughts?
There were quite a few things that really impacted me that will stay with me. I think one of the key ones was being in the desert, the physical environment of the desert. You're just kind of in the rhythm of walking and breathing and, looking forward to a wrap and some peanut butter at lunchtime. But apart from that, that's the distractions are food and water, really, and some conversation.
The hope of water.
yeah, that's it. I think life in the UK for me can be very I mean, digital, you've always got your phone on you. There are so many distractions all of the time. Everything demands your attention all of the time, or at least it feels like it. And that's partly down to my choices. But when you're walking, it doesn't have to be in the desert, but when you're walking somewhere remote, there's no distractions. The landscape in the Negev is incredibly beautiful, but also quite monotonous sometimes. So you just get into this rhythm of listening to your footfall, controlling your breathing, and being aware of various pain.
Yeah, exactly.
And it does become kind of a meditative state of being really aware of yourself and not being able to hide from your own thoughts. And I think life at the moment, can facilitate that, distracting yourself from the things that are really bothering you, which is sometimes really helpful. But when it goes on for a long period of time, I think you can become a bit detached from yourself.
Yeah.
So that really helped me. And I think for me, my faith is very much about that. I love the Hebrew idea that the spiritual and the physical are not distinct or separate. They're completely interwoven.
Yeah.
And for me, being in, nature and being aware of my own body and my own thoughts and processing some stuff that I really needed to do, it just really helped me and helped me connect with God. And I came back feeling so much more peaceful and back in the midst of distractions. I think I've learned at least a little bit how to do that in the midst of normal life.
Oh, very good. I think you went home more at peace. I could see that.
I felt like it. Yeah. What about you?
It's interesting you mentioned that sort of sense of peace, because that's really the theme that I've been really investigating on this whole sort of journey of this podcast and the book. And I'd seen it in other people. So it's been a real privilege to see that defiant peace in people that overcomes the situation around them. But I hadn't experienced it myself, really. And so both from the people we met who took us in, that was a beautiful thing to experience, that hospitality from different people groups. That was kind of, from a human perspective, a real game changer. I wasn't just witnessing compassion, I was experiencing it. But I also felt that there's a quote by Augustine, the famous North African philosopher, who said that our hearts are restless until we find our rest in you. That was kind of like a prayer in Confessions. And I sensed that in that sort of divine moment when I felt like God rescued me, and it can't have been, that peace didn't come from within. There's a sort of narrative in Western individualistic culture that says, you have the solutions within you, just dig deeper. And it's good to have self-confidence and not be self-loathing. I get that. It's important to an extent. But surely all the solutions to us can't come from within. And it's almost cruel to say to someone when they're really struggling, just dig even deeper, like I've got nothing. And there was moments when I had nothing. And actually, I couldn't just muster up the strength from within. But actually, I felt like something or someone from outside of me brought an extraordinary joy and some kind of prophetic direction that totally eclipsed the anxiety of the moment. And that peace, I don't know. For all the trials of a desert road, I wouldn't change that experience for all the comforts in the world.
Thank you for listening to the Luke X podcast. If you want to dig deeper into these stories and others like them, you can find them in the book Finding the Peacemakers by me, Dan Morrice, published by Hodder & Stoughton, available from wherever you buy books. If you're enjoying the Luke X podcast, don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. And if you want to see some footage from this desert expedition, there are 3 short films on the Luke X Project website. That's lukex.org. Under Adventures, all the films and images are also available on the Luke X Project socials. Just search the Luke X Project on Facebook and Instagram, and we'll post the links in the show notes. Thanks to Pete Kessell for dragging me through the first week of the desert and being the brother I needed. And thanks to the countless people in the wilderness, unsung heroes, who stepped in and rescued these restless wanderers. In the next episode, I catch up with old friends Louise Glenn, Dan Coe, and Daniel Abrahamson as we reflect on our encounters with Palestinian peacemakers in Bethlehem. All that to come in the next episode.